love for my brothers. I got love for my brothers.
What is up, ladies and gentlemen? It is your long lost, newly found brother, Jamey. Welcome to the very first episode of a podcast that you can expect shows every Tuesday, and we will be bringing on guests eventually. But for the first few shows, I want to develop a baseline that this entire show is coming from. I want to build the context. I want to define the relationship. For instance, why brother? Why brother? Please don't say it that way if we're going to say it. For me, I am a bit biased. I'm a brother myself, not just in blood, but in spirit. And brotherhood is not something that is limited to gender. We're talking about the heart. We're talking about the essence of brotherhood. We're talking about that bond, that relational bond that shows up for you in the trenches of your life, in the mud. And a bit of the reason why I'm so biased is I've had people show up for me when they really didn't have to. They weren't getting paid to do it. They really had nothing to gain from it. And my life was just so messy. But they showed up for me. They held space. And we'll talk about a lot of the principles. I hate the word principles. We'll talk about the framework that builds the definition of brotherhood. But today I want to start from the heart of it. Why I want to make a show with brotherhood as the focus. I began my professional life at the age of 15. I shouldn't say my professional life because I didn't really get paid for the first 3 years. But I became a pastor at the age of 15. And we'll go into a lot of the details of my backstory in the next few episodes. But I want to start with the framework of brotherhood and the specifics and details that revolve around that center point. I noticed pretty early on that you can't be effective in any kind of service, any kind of ministry to people, if you are not able to come from an empathetic place. And in order to come from an empathetic place, it's not just about being an empath. I think sometimes people use that as a bit of an excuse to tell people whatever they think about their lives and say, well, I'm just feeling what you're feeling. I'm just tapped. I'm an empath. I feel what you feel. I absorb the energy of the environment. I feel what other people are feeling. But even more than that, that's definitely part of it. That's more of a symptom of empathy than it is the baseline of empathy. In order to open yourself empathetically to others around you, it begins by opening up your heart. It begins with vulnerability. It begins by being willing to bleed first. There's a transparency there. There's an honesty there. There's a bit of a letting go of a need to control others' perception of you. And most of all, it deals with a real ability to listen, which is the foundation of all real, true, rich experience in life, which we'll get into in one of my next episodes, how to listen. Because I would venture to say 95% of at least the West, does not know how to actually listen. That wasn't something I learned how to do until maybe 3 years ago. Such a classic symptom of toxic masculinity, by the way. The inability to listen. We have so many good talkers. But what are you really saying? What are you really speaking if we don't even have the ability to listen? Because how can I know if I'm saying anything effective or advantageous to you if I can't even hear myself? If I can't hear myself, how can I hear you? So we will get into that in the next few episodes because I am very, very passionate about that subject. Not just that subject, but that reality, that habit. I'm not a guy big on theories anymore. I think that's part of a symptom of me being in a very philosophical role for most of my life. is I hate fluffy stuff. You know what I mean? I hate the kind of talks where we all sit around the table and talk about how we're gonna change the world. It sounds so noble. It sounds so noble, and we all leave with great big egos because, man, we're really trying to change the world. And you have people say things like this sometimes. Well, it just is what it is. It just is what it is. My church shut down during COVID, and we'll get into the story of that eventually. But it led me into many different avenues and attempts to make some sort of sense of where my life was going when I was finished pastoring. And I knew I wanted to help people. So I tried firefighting. I became a wildland firefighter for a period of time. I tried out for the NBA G League. You're like, what does that have to do with helping people? That was a selfish endeavor for sure. Made it into the player pool, by the way. We can talk about that sometime. But after I didn't get a call for the NBA G League, just really found myself floundering a bit. We had moved to the mountains. There's so many details I want to get into eventually, but my point in this first episode is to kind of lead you through a more zoomed out perspective of the story. We had moved to California, and I had gotten into a kind of work called crisis support, where it's essentially showing up most of the time right before you're either about to go to jail or you just can't really function effectively in society at this point. And most of the time you're showing up when hope is nearly lost or it's been lost. Fluffy doesn't work. Ideas don't work. Theories don't work. Principles don't work. Methods don't work. It's about an ability to show up in a very, very present structure in the midst of chaos. And when you're working with chaos, none of those talks about how to change the world, they don't do anything. And what I found is that even just in my own experience, I'm someone who has I have the ability to talk a big game. But I found quickly in that work, it doesn't matter how big of a game you talk, you will get tossed. You will get crushed in this line of work if you don't have something deeply rooted in you beyond just the ability to talk well, just the ability to even motivate someone. Because a lot of pastoring, sure, you can give a sermon once a week, right? Maybe you even run a small group another day. Maybe you even run some one-on-one meetings. But there's a whole nother thing in this new line of work where sometimes you're staying with someone, you're sleeping in the same room as them. Sometimes 2 days, sometimes 10 days, sometimes 20 days, sometimes 30 days. But there's no speaking and then leaving back home to some sort of hidden castle. There's no separation. And what I found in my own experience is that the greatest changes happened in the messiest moments. That the greatest outcomes, the most positive outcomes happened right at the end of the rope. And what this show was meant to do, we were having a branding conversation. There's nothing, ladies and gentlemen, that I hate more than a conversation on branding. Oh my gosh. Hey man, what's your target audience? Like literally, I will throw this table. I will throw this table across the room. Hey man, yeah, so let's talk about your target demographic. I don't know why it makes me so mad. I want to reach as many people, help as many people as I possibly can through this show. I always used to say that. Why can't we just have everybody be your target demographic? And I know my friends in business are like, if you try to reach everybody, you're going to reach nobody. I disagree on some levels, but specificity is effective. So the conversation is helpful to some degree. It is. And a lot of who this show is for, I'm dedicating this show in a lot of ways to the people who have hit the trench. You've gotten hit and come back so many times, but you don't know if you can get up one more time. I don't know if I can keep going with this. You've been so relentlessly positive, and you've been so relentlessly consistent to dreaming big and to planning big, and you have such big faith. I'm making this show not just for people who are looking to make something out of your life, but people who have tried to make something so big out of their lives, and yet it just seems like they haven't really had it pay off yet, and you're feeling like, I just don't know if I can keep going. In a lot of ways, this show is for people at the end of the rope, when it feels like the light is almost out, if not completely out. What a brother does is he meets you in the mud and he says, we'll crawl out together. I want to build this show not just as a show, but as a space that embodies brotherhood in its purest form, which means I want to build a space that holds space for people to find their power in, not a space that tries to be a hero for people, but a space that embodies a guide to people, because there's a narcissism to heroism. There's a bit of a thing, especially if you're constantly looking to save people. I mean, it's the mechanism that colonization is built on. Colonization isn't just about let's get the gold and let's get the labor and it's not that. It's more than anything. The religious center of colonization is built on the let me help you. Let me help you. You need me. No, my goodness. The white European empires had come to a place where they believed they were the highest form of human evolution. And so therefore, with that definition, there's a justification to, oh, let me help you. In their minds, there's a justification. Immediately before they decimate entire people groups, languages, cultures, histories, they're thinking that they're helping. The way to hell is paved by good intentions. That's why, we notice that in romantic relationships, right? Beware of that partner. Beware of that guy. Beware when they come and they say, no, you need me. I think you need me. The ability to create dependency. And that's why I talk about holding space, because that is the posture of a guide. A hero in many ways takes space. I'll fish for you. I'll do it for you. But a guide will teach you how to fish. A guide will hold space and say, you have the power to do this. You already know what to do. You don't need to know anything else. You already know everything you need to know. It's just a matter of someone supporting you, saying, I got your back. No, I'm really going to stand with you here. A lot of this show is based on the very first murder in the Bible. The very first conflict, violent conflict. And it's a story of two brothers. It's not a story of two opposing people groups. They become opposing people groups, ironically. But it begins as two brothers. It begins as a family conflict. And where it starts is two brothers, one named Cain and another named Abel. And Cain kills his brother Abel for many different reasons that we could interpret it as. Many would say jealousy. I don't necessarily want to get into the root of the murder. More of what happens after the murder. That also leads us to the root of the murder. God in the story shows up to Cain right after the murder and says, where is your brother? Cain says, I don't know. And he asks a question that I see as the central question of this show. It is the central question in most of our cultural conversation in the world right now. Am I my brother's keeper? What's the heart of that question? Am I responsible for my brother's well-being? Am I my brother's keeper? This is the same question in a lot of ways that white America was in a way forced to ask when we encountered as a nation, as a human race. This conversation was happening globally around what happened in Minneapolis in 2020 with George Floyd. Am I held responsible? It's a heavy question. And I do want to say it was such an honor because I feel that my generation in Black America, not just Black America around the world, but specifically Black America, it was called the racial reckoning. I don't know if you guys have heard that term yet. I just heard that a few months ago, and it was a reckoning. And a lot of that is to the praise and credit of young Black America, holding institutions to a level of accountability that simply hadn't been done, harnessing social media in a way that the amount of white families that separated during that time, not that that was necessarily the goal, but it was an explosion. It was truly a reckoning, especially in the United States. But the reckoning, at the heart of the reckoning, I would say this is the central question. Am I my brother's keeper? Am I responsible? The story, not only does it teach us the heart of brotherhood, but it also teaches us the heart of responsibility. It teaches us brotherhood is not a special trait that we take on because we're good people. Brotherhood is a natural human dignity. It is a natural respect for each other. And with that respect comes a responsibility. And what I think is so powerful here is that not only does it tell us what the heart of brotherhood is, it also tells us something about what responsibility is. And especially when we're the ones to ask the question, am I really responsible for your well-being? Am I my brother's keeper? What this story tells us is usually if we're the ones asking, am I responsible for your well-being? We're probably the ones holding a bloody knife and a smoking gun. Yeah, the answer is yes. If I am aware of your suffering and I choose to look the other way, silence is violence. That statement is true. The moment I become aware of your suffering and I choose to look another way, that's the kind of thinking that creates the pick yourself up by your bootstraps message that was given to Black America for so long. Usually, again, you can see how this immediately flips. Essentially what it's saying is, are we held responsible? Is white America held responsible? But again, if we're the ones asking ourselves the question, are we held responsible? We're probably the reason that you even have to pick yourself up by bootstraps, even though there are no bootstraps. This is also in therapy what we see. It's a term called scapegoating. And it's essentially a human being has to find a way to be okay. And in order to be okay, you have to feel in some sense that there is a rightness to you. But in order to feel that you're right, everything's all right, there has to be a source of blame. And if responsibility is scary to you, what we will resort to is off-sourcing the blame, most often to the victim of our abuse. I don't use that word victim lightly in any way. But when I say that I want to build a space that holds space for people to take their power, this is what brotherhood does. There's a togetherness. There's an identification. There's a responsibility that I have to you because what I do to you is what I do to me. It is loving your neighbor as yourself because what I do to you is what I do to myself. If I hate you, it's purely because I hate me. If I condemn you, it's purely because I condemn myself. I can't love you to a greater degree than I have loved myself. I can't give you grace that I haven't given myself. And that's what I found as a pastor. One of my greatest weaknesses was I only knew how to create dependence because myself, I was a dependent. And as a leader, I couldn't lead anyone anywhere I hadn't been. And that can be a poison that exists in a lot of spaces built to help people, is especially for leaders. One of your most important priorities is learning how to be free yourself. If you are not free, please don't try to lead anyone to your freedom. Please, please, please. I'm saying this from experience. Leadership is a heavy, glorious, noble responsibility. But that responsibility should not be taken up if the journey of freedom is not something you have dedicated yourself to. But there's a grace there, because how can we experience something that we're unaware of? How can I explain smell to you if you've never smelled? We don't know what we don't know, and we do our best with what we do. But this show is not meant to create dependence. I want everything that we put out in this community to empower you to engage with life, to create space, to present an option as clear as I possibly can for you to take your power. And we're going to go into what power is. I see that as being the theme of season 1 for this show. And we'll go into that very deeply in the next episode. But I wanted to start with the responsibility of brotherhood. In essence, the heart of brotherhood holds a deep responsibility for each other because it deeply identifies with each other. There is no empathy without identification, which is why you can't empathize with a man being choked out for 8 minutes if you can't identify with that man being choked out for 8 minutes, which is why dehumanization will usually be the most effective way to separate people. How can I dehumanize you? We have many different methods of doing it. But those little pieces of sabotage that take away from our humanity. It's the easiest marketing plan in the world, especially in politics. Create them and prove that they can't be fully human. Which in today's scientific world, try to prove that they're a monster. A huge, huge, huge passion of this show. Because of the populations that I've worked with in my own service, there are no monsters. It's just us. It's only us. And that's a big thing we don't want to fully confront, because if there are no monsters, then what are we truly capable of? We are the monster in the closet. Part of the reason we're terrified of that is that brings on a certain level of responsibility, because we become aware of our potential, not just for goodness, but for evil. With great power comes great responsibility. We could flip that another way and say with great responsibility comes great power. It begins with ownership, and ownership begins with identification. And it's a bit of a hard sell in a day where the narrative of powerlessness is something so prevalent. I refuse to bow to that narrative in any regard. I refuse to bow to a narrative that we are at the mercy of our government and we are at the mercy of external circumstances. No. The people have always had the power. In any system that has ever taken power over us, we have given it that power. And that can be a bit of a hard pill to swallow, but the fact is we don't take our power until we recognize the choices we have made to be at the mercy of something external. It's all in us already. The opportunity to choose, to create our lives. We are children of God, and what it means to be a child of God is not only are we like God in our character, but we have the ability to create the way that God creates. And God has the ability to create something from nothing. God is at the mercy of nothing. There's a sufficiency there. There's always all options on the table, an infinite amount of options on the table. You are never trapped. And I know when it feels like the light has gone out in your life and you feel like, I don't have any options, Jamey. Like, no, bro, you don't get it. Like, you don't get it. Like, I don't have any options, bro. If there's any reason you came across this show, bro, it's just for somebody to tell you, number one, it's not over. Number two, you're not trapped. You're not trapped. For anyone watching this show, listening, watching, and you're at the end of the rope and you're telling yourself, I don't think I have the energy to go any longer. Part of the illusion of pain is the permanence. It's not permanent. It's not permanent. Just as your brother, let's hold on just a second longer. Just give it one more breath. So many times, it's just one more breath. There's always light. Just because the clouds fill the sky does not mean that the sun does not shine. There's always hope. Even if you feel hopeless, there's always always hope. I promise you. I promise you. I've seen it too many times. I've been working with hopelessness for over a decade and a half now. And what I can tell you is that it's usually right when you feel like you've hit the threshold, that the threshold is a launch pad. It will pass. It will pass. But I stand here with you in it. And that's why a lot of what I mean by building a community is I do want a place where that support is embodied, not just by me, but by people who are in this community. That people who feel hopeless, that you would have a place you could breathe in without judgment. And then we'd stand with each other because we identify with each other. Are we our brother's keeper? Are you your brother's keeper? And I won't answer that for you. But what that question essentially is asking is, what are you responsible for? Responsibility is not something that I have always been good at. We could say responsibility and ownership is the doorway between immaturity and maturity. The doorway from powerlessness to power. It's taking back what we have given over. The mercy of circumstance, the mercy of this happening to me and that happening to me and this happening to me and that happening to me. And in no way does that invalidate our pain. As a matter of fact, I would say whatever we feel to the utmost in regards to our pain, we will come to a place where it is not in avoidance of our pain that we choose ownership. It is in honor of our pain. That is why it is so important with grief. And that is a huge piece of this show. We'll get into my own process of grief in the next few episodes. But it is so vital to feel, to acknowledge. Number one, acknowledge, then feel. But if we take it all the way, what it will come to is no longer avoidance that brings ownership, but honor that brings ownership. And what I mean by ownership is we can't change the events of our past. We can only change the interpretation. We can only control our narrative, our perspective of the story. What story are we living? We get the God-ordained power to choose that framework. And that is the doorway to power. That is the doorway to creating as God creates. That's why there is room for all of us to be free. I don't need to take your freedom in order for me to be free. This is why we can say dictators. There has never been a dictator who has operated from a place of self-mastery or self-control. That I will only look to control you externally if I cannot control myself inwardly. That it is only a compensation of a lack of control that I feel within myself that would inspire me to need to take from you. This is why personal ownership is the road to personal freedom. And if we can all take that path, what it ends up bringing us to is a place of such rich abundance where we give freedom, give power, become gods, no longer villains or heroes or victims. Part of where I see this practically, I have to admit, this will evolve over time. And I don't necessarily know exactly how the details will form, but I see the framework. Part of the reason why I love Substack so much is that it allows a lot of room for the discourse, for the conversation, for community building. And that's where I see this community beginning a lot of these conversations. If you've been following me for a while, I've been writing about these topics for at least 4 or 5 years now. And you can find more material there. If you want to connect with me, you can connect with me there. But also, I'd love for us to make connections with each other in that space. Yeah. The essence of brotherhood is identification with each other. That I can identify with you because I see myself in you. And that is the birthplace of empathy. And with that empathy, there's nothing that can't be healed. If I can see myself in you, we can always make peace. But it begins with a personal choice of ownership. And thank you. so much for listening to the very first episode of your brother Jamey. Again, you can connect with me on Substack. That's where I'm doing most interacting. That's where I spend most of my time. I don't love Instagram. I just don't love it. I actually have it deleted off my phone. I pretty much on Instagram, if I ever miss a message, I'm sorry. I literally just post and then delete it because it's just a vortex, man. I definitely acknowledge my limit there. But send me a message on Substack on anything you'd like to hear in the future on this show. But most of all, I'm so grateful for your time. And if anything, I pray that this inspires you to engage with life on your terms, to be as free as you possibly could ever want to be. I'm your brother. I love you. Thank you for watching.